Greetings and welcome back. This week, with the help of a couple of bad kitties who aren't supposed to be on the crafting table, I'm able to get my wife's Viking tunic finished for her costume for the DragonCon Pulse Raid. Very similar to the vest that Lagertha wore in one of the series of Vikings, this vest is constructed of a 2 and 3 ounce leather strips that are laced together in a crisscross fashion. I think that the original thing used just a continuous loop thing, but I chose to crisscross them. It is an incredibly resource efficient pattern because I'm able to use strips of leather that would normally have probably gone to waste because so many of them are so thin, and it allows the vest to be formed for curves that doesn't have to be wet molded and stuff like that. The way the pattern is traced out. As you'll see in the video, we started the vest with a duct tape pattern and then drew lines on it, cut it to pieces, cut the strips of leather, and then laced them all together. Side note, you won't normally see me wearing sleeveless t-shirts and stuff like that, particularly on film. But while I was working on this tunic, I was also working on my mead. But Eric, what does that got to do with anything? Well, one of the things that I discovered the last time when I actually started the batch of mead is making mead can be messy. It can be dangerous too. Oh, that hurt. Used a pretty standard duct tape style pattern, cut it up off the back and put it on a dress form. Started laying out the holes for the neckline and the arms. Once that was done, I took the shirt that my wife created for her Viking costume and laid it over top and used it to make reference lines to cut away the neck. She wants the dragon for the beadwork and the needlepoint or whatever it is that she did. She wants that exposed so that people can see it. So she didn't want to cover it up, so I needed to cut away the neckline. And from there, it was just taking one side of the vest and trying to segment it into as even width strips as possible. Drawing lines down the sides and up the front. Then from there, I'm just going to cut this thing into 4 pieces. And then I'm going to cut those 4 pieces into more pieces. Once I was happy with the lines, I went through and numbered them all so that I didn't lose them and I could keep them organized. Then moved my way around to the back. Once I had all the lines drawn, I cut the tunic in half up the middle. Trimmed away the excess material on the neck and the arms. I then went through and made a bunch of registration marks on all the lines. This is going to help me line the patterns up once I start cutting all the pieces apart and I'm ready to start piecing the leather together. And then it was onto the seam at the shoulder, registration marks, then cut it out. And then the same process on the strips going down the front of the vest. And once I had everything marked, started cutting the strips apart. About that time I realized that the strip that went down the back didn't need to be 3 pieces and it didn't need to be curved, so I went ahead and straightened it out and cut it into 2 pieces. And cut the excess material off the bottom at the front, and then cut the front pieces into strips. Now that I had everything cut out, I laid it out on the table nicely to make sure that all of the pieces were going to actually lay flat. With a little bit of help from Bellatrix, I started transferring the cloth patterns onto the leather. But eventually something shiny caught her attention and she moved on. So I originally started tracing the pattern one way, flipping it over, drawing it out on the leather the other way, and it didn't take me very long to realize that because the cloth is so flimsy and flexible, I wasn't going to be able to get consistent sides. So instead what I started doing was I would trace the pattern one way, cut that piece out, and then use the leather, flip the leather over, and use the leather to trace out the second one. This way, if nothing else, each piece was identical from side to side. Unfortunately, it took me a couple of tries to get used to this new system. I finally had everything cut out. I laid both pieces on top of one another and then laid the pattern to make sure that everything was cut properly and I had the appropriate amount of pieces. That was a lot of leather cutting. Now, in an effort to keep the number of colors in this costume to a minimum, instead of dyeing this leather, I actually used resist. And this is just a tan resist. Worked out really, really well because it picked up all the little imperfections in the leather and made them look kind of dirty and like the vest had been worn and was kind of grungy. Really, really nice effect. Quite happy with it. Yeah, normally resist is used for carving, but that's the point of this, right? To try something new. So then I laid the duct tape patterns on top of the leather and made very small marks to mark the registration marks so that when I started lining the patterns, I knew where I could punch the holes. I started with piece number 1, punched holes all the way down the length, then took piece number 2, laid it beside each other, lined up the registration marks, and marked the holes that corresponded that were going to get laced. And then I did that through the entire side, punched those holes, flipped it over, and then did the other side. And in that way I did pieces 1 and 2, and then pieces 2 and 3, and then pieces 3 and 4, and then 4 and 5, and then 5 and 6. And I did this all the way around to the back where it's split up the middle and also going to be grommeted. Like I said earlier, one of the advantages to this pattern is there's no wet molding to go around curves or anything. One of the downsides is that the pieces tend to be kind of curvy and bendy, so you really got to be very careful where you line the holes up. Otherwise, the patterns won't quite match. Also, in retrospect, I could have straightened out some of the lines on my pattern a little bit more than I did. Once I had the entire right side punched, I just flipped the pieces over onto the other side and then marked the holes with a Sharpie and then went through and punched them. It took me a lot less time to do the left side of the vest than it did the right side. And I used an orange Sharpie, so if I made a mistake, it didn't show up. Thousands of tiny little pieces of leather from the punch. With everything punched, laid the pieces flat out on the table and started lacing. I used a double crisscross style stitch instead of the standard just kind of whip style stitch that they used in the show. One of the things that I did discover is I had to be real careful that I didn't pull them too tight. You pull them too tight and it'll pucker the leather and it'll look funny. And it makes the video a little longer, but I intentionally left this piece slow so that people could see how I laced it, just in case they want to try it. And when I reached the top of the piece, I would just tie a knot and then trim away or break away the excess material. I had managed to successfully join 3 pieces when Haggard decided it was time for attention. I don't think I'm going to get anything else done today. Like his sister, eventually Haggard found something shiny and moved on. And it was back to more lacing. If you take a look at this piece, you can actually see where it is starting to take shape now. It's even though the pieces were each flat, the way they lace together, they actually have some curve to them. Early on in this project, I got greedy and tried to use really, really, really long pieces of lace. One of the things I discovered is the much shorter pieces of lace are much easier to use, and it's very easy to keep the pieces rolled over so that the lace stays flat, versus using real long pieces that tend to bunch up, twist, and if you're using cheap lace, sometimes break. And finally, the last piece. Instead of lacing the 2 pieces that go up the center of the back together, we put grommets in them, and we're going to just use those as a point of adjustment in case we need to change the size or anything. And like many of the other grommets that I've ever put in, just punched a bunch of 1/4-inch holes, put the grommets in there, and then set them in there very carefully. Still managed to screw a couple of them up, but set them in and then hammered them down. From there, I used the center line on the chest and back to line up and punched the area in the shoulders that the seam is going to join. And then I used the same crisscross style stitch that I used on the rest of the vest on the shoulders. This is fairly inexpensive, just
regular leather lace that I picked up at Hobby Lobby. You got to be really, really careful if you're going to pull on it with a pair of pliers. It'll break easily. And with the shoulders all laced up and everything fitted, I went through and just started punching holes all along the bottom of the vest. And to give the bottom of the vest a little bit of finish, I ran lace all the way around. The collar pattern for the area that I needed to cut out for the shirt underneath, laid it on the back side of the leather, traced it out, and then cut that out with a pair of good leather scissors. When I cut it, I did not cut on the line because unlike metal, it's really hard to add material back to leather when you cut too much. Marked out the holes for the grommets on one side of the vest, took the vest to the punching board on the floor and marked and punched those holes out. Folded them over, marked out the other one, and then punched those holes too. Then once I had all the holes punched, I installed the grommets, but you don't get to see that because I forgot to turn the camera on.
I've got a little bit of cleanup work left to do on it. I'm going to lace around the arms and around the neck and down the front, but my wife wants to finish sprucing up her shirt and adding a little bit more beadwork and stuff like that to it. Until she's done there, I don't want to do that because if I've got to cut away the opening a little bit more, it's just a waste of time having to go through and pull the lace off. Waste of lace too, but it was a lot of fun to make. Really enjoyed that one. This particular pattern we chose because it's something I had never done before. One of the things that I like to do when I do a lot of the cosplay stuff is learn new techniques and try new things. It gives me a great excuse to use materials that otherwise would probably just go to waste. Like I said, upside of the pattern, really, really, really resource effective and efficient. Downside of the pattern, it's a whole bunch of punching holes and a whole bunch of lacing. It was a lot of fun though. I'll see you next week.